It began quietly, not with soldiers in the streets or the sound of weapons, but with a single sheet of paper stamped in Washington. On August 1st, 2025, the United States announced a sudden 50% tariff on Burkina Faso's most important export, Shea butter. There was no warning, no discussion, and no time for families to prepare. One decision, made thousands of miles away, was enough to shake the livelihood of an entire nation. For more than 2 decades, Shea butter has been far more than just another product on shelves in American or European stores. It has been the work of over 160,000 women in Burkina Faso. They are mothers, grandmothers, and sisters who rise before the sun, crack nuts by hand, and labor under the hot sky to produce what they call women's gold. That gold has paid for school fees, food on the table, medicine for the sick, and the fragile hope that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. Now, in the span of a single morning, that hope was threatened. In a rural village, a woman named Amanatada sat on the red earth, her hands thick with shea paste, and whispered a question that revealed the fear of countless families. Will I be able to feed my children tomorrow? Across the country, trucks stopped on the roadside, factories stood silent, and fear spread like smoke carried by the wind. In Washington, the tariff was defended as policy. In Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré called it something else: economic warfare. They tax not just our labor, he said, but our heritage and the very hands that keep our families alive. His words traveled quickly, moving from radios in rural markets to crowded city streets, igniting anger, but also determination. This was never only about trade. It was about dignity, survival, and the question of whether a small, landlocked nation could resist the pressure of a superpower. Would Burkina Faso bend under the weight of history, or would it rise and begin to rewrite it? The impact of Washington's decree was swift and painful. Within hours of the tariff announcement, the lifeline of Burkina Faso's Shea industry began to collapse. Procurement offices that once buzzed with activity went silent. Export managers tried desperately to reach American distributors, but the calls went unanswered. In Missouri, Florida, and Texas, buyers who had once relied on Burkina Faso's butter disappeared from the phone lines. Some shifted orders to Ghana or Benin. Others froze their contracts entirely, unwilling to take the risk of further sanctions. In Bobo Dioulasso, the nation's main transport hub, truckloads of shea butter sat unmoved for days. Drivers who were paid only when they delivered slept in their cars, waiting for orders that never came. One driver told a local reporter, "Every hour we sit here, our families go without money. How do I explain that to my children?" Within 48 hours, the volume of goods moving across the highways fell by 32%. In Kaya, a cooperative leader named Salamata Konate gathered her team of women under the shade of a neem tree. With quiet determination, she told them, "They think we are only exporters, but we are more than that. We are mothers. We are fighters." Her words echoed the feelings of thousands of women across the countryside. They were not just losing contracts. They were losing the security of putting food on the table and paying school fees for their children. Across villages, warehouses shut their gates and factories suspended procurement. For women who had spent decades shaping shea nuts into paste with their bare hands, the silence of locked doors carried a message. Washington's move was not just about business. It was about control. The West was reminding Burkina Faso of its place in the global order. The White House issued no detailed explanation, only vague statements about national interest and economic realignment. Behind closed doors in Washington, the strategy was clear. This was about pressure. This was about forcing compliance without a single soldier crossing a border. Yet what U.S. officials underestimated was the resilience of the Burkinabe people and the resolve of their young president. President Ibrahim Traoré did not beg for relief. He did not wait for sympathy. Instead, within hours of the decree, he called an emergency meeting of his trade council. Standing before the cameras in Ouagadougou, he called the tariff what it was: economic warfare against our women, against our land, against our dignity. The speech was broadcast across the nation, carried on radios in rural villages and televisions in city squares. For many citizens, it was the first time they had heard their leader openly name the pressure for what it truly was. The effect was immediate. Anger turned into unity. Villagers who once saw politics as distant now felt personally attacked. Cooperative leaders, truck drivers, and factory workers realized they were all caught in the same battle. "This is not only about butter," one man said outside a closed warehouse. "This is about whether we are free." The economic pain deepened as days passed. In Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, shelves that once held products proudly labeled "made with shea butter from Burkina Faso" began to empty. Small businesses dependent on authentic shea struggled to stay afloat. One store owner in Miami admitted that she had begun sealing shipping boxes by hand at night to save on costs. "If rent goes up again, we are finished," she said. For American consumers, the change was subtle at first. Creams felt different. Lotions no longer absorbed smoothly. Soon, complaints appeared online. "This isn't real shea," one reviewer wrote. "Something is wrong." The reputation of entire product lines began to suffer. The irony was sharp. A policy meant to punish Burkina Faso was instead shaking confidence in American brands. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré worked late into the night inside the presidential palace. He studied trade maps, reviewed logistical corridors, and prepared not for retreat, but for a counterattack. While warehouses stood idle and families held their breath, he quietly sketched out a new path forward. The world expected Burkina Faso to fold. Instead, its young leader was preparing to pivot. The crisis that Washington thought would break the nation was about to spark a transformation that could rewrite the rules of African trade. On the morning of August 2nd, less than 24 hours after the tariff shook his nation, President Ibrahim Traoré called an emergency gathering in Ouagadougou. Inside the capital's main assembly hall, regional agricultural unions, cooperative leaders, and government officials filled the seats. Some had traveled overnight from distant provinces. Others came directly from shuttered warehouses and silent processing plants. What they expected was reassurance. What they received was defiance. Standing before the crowd, Traoré spoke with a steady voice that carried the weight of a soldier and the vision of a statesman. "They will not break us by starving our people," he declared. "If they tax our women's labor, then we will find new hands to value it. If they close one door, then we will open another." The words spread across the nation like wildfire. Radios repeated them in village markets. Smartphones buzzed with recordings in city streets. Within hours, the phrase became a rallying cry. In the rural hills of Kenadougou, women gathered outside their cooperatives, repeating the sentence to one another as both comfort and promise. "They will not break us," an elderly woman said, adjusting her headscarf as younger women beside her nodded. For years they had felt invisible in the global supply chain. Now their work, their heritage, was being defended at the highest level of power. The response was not only domestic. Across Africa and beyond, the young president's words made headlines. In Nairobi, Kenyan broadcasters called it a new chapter in African resistance. In Mumbai and Dubai, analysts debated how a landlocked nation could challenge a superpower's decision. In London, financial traders scrambled as the Shea futures index spiked by 11% in a single day. Panic spread through European markets as they realized how dependent global industries had become on a single commodity harvested by women in West Africa. In the United States, silence spoke louder than words. The White House offered no press conference. Trade officials gave only vague comments about realignment and national interest. Yet behind closed doors, officials knew the pressure had backfired. Small businesses across America were already struggling. Consumers were noticing changes in their favorite creams and lotions. Customer complaints were piling up. In Burkina Faso, the mood was tense but determined. At a small cooperative in Kaya, Salamata Konate once again gathered her team. Looking at women who now feared their families would go hungry, she raised her voice. "We are not weak. We are not voiceless. If America believes it can erase us, let them watch as we build new partners." Her words were met with applause, some clapping through tears, others with clenched fists. Traoré himself was not celebrating. Inside the presidential palace, he reviewed maps of trade routes, marked weak roads for repair, and tasked his ministers with preparing for a pivot that no one expected. He knew that speeches alone would not save his people. Action had to follow. And then came the turning point. On August 4th, just 3 days after the crisis began, news broke that China's Ministry of Commerce had issued official import licenses for 128 companies in Burkina Faso. The agreement was clear and unprecedented. 5 years of guaranteed trade, no quotas, no hidden debt, direct rail access, priority refining rights. In Ouagadougou, the announcement was received with a mixture of relief and astonishment. In villages, women began to dance outside their cooperatives, singing that tomorrow they would work again. One woman named Ayo told a reporter, "This means we have food tomorrow, and maybe next week, and maybe the year after. Internationally, the reaction was immediate. In Abidjan and Lomé, Chinese buyers arrived to coordinate shipments. In Shenzhen, Nanjing, and Tianjin, construction began on 3 new Shea butter processing facilities. Jobs were promised. Infrastructure was laid. What had started as a desperate defense now looked like a decisive realignment of global trade. The phrase Shea diplomacy began circulating across African media. Commentators explained that Burkina Faso had done more than survive a tariff. It had transformed a commodity into a weapon of sovereignty. This was no longer just butter. It was power. The climax of the crisis was clear. What Washington had intended as a move to weaken Burkina Faso had instead triggered an international partnership worth $2.1 billion. A small, landlocked country had not folded. It had pivoted, and the entire world was watching. But the question lingered in every capital city. Was this a one-time victory, or the beginning of a larger movement? Could other African nations follow Burkina Faso's example, taking control of cocoa, palm oil, cashews, and cotton? Or would powerful nations retaliate with stronger measures to keep the old order intact? The signing of the $2.1 billion trade agreement with China did not simply rescue Burkina Faso's Shea industry. It rewrote the nation's political and social identity. For decades, Burkina Faso, like many African states, had exported raw resources only to see them refined and sold back in luxury packaging at hundreds of times the price. President Traoré called this cycle economic servitude. With the new agreement, that pattern was broken. The deal required not just export of raw shea, but local processing, technology transfers, and training for Burkinabe workers. Solar dryers, logistics hubs, and factory training programs were built into the contract. For the first time, women who once cracked nuts barefoot in dusty courtyards were scanning shipping manifests, negotiating with foreign buyers, and even learning Mandarin to communicate with new partners. Each ton of refined butter left the country stamped with a new national seal known as women's gold. It was more than a label. It was a statement of sovereignty. On the streets of Ouagadougou, people spoke with pride about the transformation. Radio shows debated whether cocoa in Ghana or palm oil in Nigeria could follow the same model. In Dakar, student activists painted murals with the phrase, "From soil to sovereignty." What began as a crisis for one nation had become a blueprint for a continent. Yet the impact was not only economic. Politically, the deal elevated Burkina Faso's standing. In Addis Ababa, diplomats at the African Union reviewed Traoré's framework for indigenous trade. It was no longer a plea for aid. It was a proposal signed with dignity. One envoy whispered, "We used to ask, now we negotiate." At home, the transformation reached classrooms. The Ministry of Education introduced lessons on indigenous trade history. One assignment asked, "What does sovereignty smell like?" A 12-year-old girl answered, "It smells like the butter my grandmother makes." For older citizens, this was more than poetry. It was proof that a new generation would grow up with pride in their country's resources rather than shame at their exploitation. But pride alone could not erase the struggles. In villages, the memories of empty warehouses and stalled trucks were still fresh. Families remembered the days of fear when they wondered if food would run out. Even as contracts flowed eastward, many asked, what if America retaliated again? What if Europe imposed new sanctions? Could the fragile gains collapse under external pressure? Internationally, these questions loomed large. Paris, once confident of its influence in West Africa, found itself bidding for access it once assumed by default. Washington, frustrated by its failed strategy, worried about a domino effect. If Burkina Faso succeeded, other nations might follow. Mali, Niger, and Guinea were already discussing new trade routes independent of Western control. For the first time, the balance of power in the Sahel began to tilt away from Europe and America. In communities across Burkina Faso, the social effects were immediate. Cooperatives that had closed their doors reopened with new energy. Women who had nearly given up on their livelihoods returned to work with a sense of dignity. One cooperative leader said, "We are no longer invisible hands. We are part of the story now." In Bobo Dioulasso, women danced in celebration, not because they were suddenly wealthy, but because they knew tomorrow they would work again. The ripple reached the political culture of the nation. Universities began teaching what they called the Shea doctrine, a case study in economic independence. Young Burkinabe leaders studied the strategy as proof that even a landlocked country could shape global trade. Posters appeared in city streets with slogans like, "We are no longer reserves, we are rivals." For the United States and its allies, the reality was sobering. What was meant to be a show of strength had turned into a symbol of miscalculation. American companies had lost consumer trust. African nations had found a rallying point. And Burkina Faso, once dismissed as small and dependent, now stood as a symbol of what could be achieved when dignity was placed above dependence. But the future remained uncertain. Would this doctrine of sovereignty withstand the test of time, or would global powers regroup and strike back harder? Was Burkina Faso leading Africa toward a new era of self-reliance, or walking into another cycle of dependency under a different partner? The questions were as real as the joy in the villages, and they left the world waiting for answers. In Washington, the official line remained cautious and vague. Trade officials repeated phrases about national security and balancing markets. Yet inside the halls of power, frustration was growing. The tariff that was meant to pressure Burkina Faso had instead weakened American companies. Small businesses that depended on authentic Shea were collapsing. Consumers who once trusted U.S. brands were now questioning the authenticity of their products. What was designed as leverage had become a liability. At the same time, policymakers worried about the broader implications. If Burkina Faso could turn a tariff into a $2.1 billion deal with China, what would stop Ghana from doing the same with cocoa, or Nigeria with palm oil, or Tanzania with cashew nuts? Could this be the start of a chain reaction that undermined decades of Western economic dominance in Africa. European capitals were no less unsettled. In Paris, officials accustomed to seeing West Africa as a sphere of influence now found themselves on the outside looking in. They could no longer assume access to markets by default. In London, financial analysts spoke of a seismic realignment, warning investors that African nations might soon demand processing and value-added contracts instead of raw exports. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the reaction was swift and confident. Construction crews broke ground on new Shea processing facilities in Shenzhen, Tianjin, and Nanjing. Chinese state media celebrated the agreement as evidence that Africa was not only a source of raw materials, but also a partner in industrial development. For China, this was more than trade. It was a chance to position itself as the ally of a continent long exploited by others. Across Africa, leaders watched closely. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, ministers debated whether their own commodities could be leveraged in the same way. In Ghana, working groups studied the potential of vertical integration in the cocoa sector. In Nigeria, conversations began about refining palm oil domestically. For the first time, African governments spoke openly about taking control of both the first mile of production and the last mile of profit. For the United States, the deeper concern was not just economic, it was strategic. Control of supply chains has always been a pillar of global power. If African nations began to set their own terms, America's influence in the Sahel and beyond could erode. And with that erosion came risks, instability, the rise of alternative alliances, and a new world order where Washington no longer wrote the rules. The old question was returning with new urgency. Was Africa merely a supplier, or was it becoming a source of power? The answer would determine not only the future of Burkina Faso, but also the balance of global trade in the years ahead. What began with a single tariff had grown into something far larger than trade. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation often overlooked in the pages of history, had not only survived economic warfare, but had transformed crisis into opportunity. In doing so, it offered a lesson to Africa and to the world. Sovereignty is not granted, it is built. The effects were immediate and symbolic. Shelves in New York and Chicago told one story, empty and uncertain. Villages in Burkina Faso told another, where women once silenced now danced because their labor was valued again. Across boardrooms in Europe and America, executives whispered a single name with new caution: Burkina Faso. The very country once dismissed as fragile now stood as a symbol of resilience and resolve. But the story is not finished. The questions are larger than shea butter. If cocoa, palm oil, or cashews follow the same model, what will happen to the global order? If African nations refuse to remain suppliers of raw goods and instead demand value, contracts, and respect, can the old powers adjust? Or will they respond with heavier sanctions, desperate to hold on to control? For the United States, the risk is not only economic but strategic. Influence in the Sahel has long been linked to stability, security, and control of resources. If nations like Burkina Faso choose their own path, Will Washington adapt or retreat? For African leaders, the challenge is equally great. Can they sustain this sovereignty without falling into a new cycle of dependence under different partners? And for ordinary people, the meaning is deeply personal. It is the story of a farmer who now receives fair payment for her harvest. It is the dignity of a cooperative leader who can stand before her community and say, "We are not invisible anymore." It is the hope of a 12-year-old girl who writes in her school book, "Sovereignty smells like the butter my grandmother makes." So we are left with a choice. Do we see this as just a trade deal? Or do we see it as the beginning of a doctrine that could redefine Africa's place in the world? Do we dismiss it as temporary? Or do we ask ourselves whether this is how a continent rises? If this story has touched you, share your thoughts. What does sovereignty mean in your language? If you believe in dignity, in fairness, and in the right of every nation to shape its own destiny, let your voice be part of this conversation. Because the story of Africa's rise is no longer distant. It is unfolding now, and it asks each of us where we stand. May the courage of a small nation remind us all that power is not measured only in weapons or wealth, but in the will to prepare, to protect, and to preserve dignity for generations to come.